Olá, aqui quem fala é Maria Laura Neves, eu sou redatora-chefe da Vogue Brasil. É um prazer participar do Fronteiras do Pensamento. Eu tenho duas perguntas para a Anne. A primeira delas é relacionada ao sistema político brasileiro e à situação política que a gente vive hoje. Como estudiosa das democracias liberais e das ameaças a essas democracias, como ela vê a situação brasileira hoje? Vivemos ainda sob um regime democrático? A segunda pergunta é relacionada ao coronavírus, à pandemia do coronavírus. Como ela acredita que a pandemia influenciou na proliferação e na adesão ao discurso nacionalista de extrema-direita, não só no Brasil, mas no mundo? Obrigada.
I'm not going to lecture a room full of Brazilians about Brazil. You know, it's your country, you know it much better than I do. I would say, first of all, that this distinction between democracy and dictatorship is often not quite as clear-cut as people assume. I mean, there are democracies, there are troubled democracies, there are democracies that are sliding into illiberalism. You know, there are a lot of stages before you get to dictatorship. I mean, I think many of us have in our heads the idea that democracy always ends with, you know, tanks in the streets and some colonel in the presidential palace taking over the television station. That's a really 20th century idea of how democracy ends. Nowadays, democracy is much more likely to be ended by democratically elected leaders. So democratically elected leaders who come to power and then try to undermine or shift or change the system. One thing I have heard from Brazil recently that is very disturbing is the language that your president now uses about elections. You know, that if he doesn't win, the election isn't fair. This technique of casting doubt upon the electoral system, which, by the way, we saw in the United States and which continues, and which has been used by other leaders in other places, can be very dangerous to democracy, because what it means is that it gives one party or one part of the society this feeling that they have the license to overturn the results. If the election is unfair, if it doesn't work, you know, then we can overturn it, and that's legitimate. And that's related to what I was saying earlier about democratic culture. You know, it's really important that nobody use that language, or that when it's used, everybody else seeks to put it aside, because the casting of doubt upon elections is one of the things that can lead to a real crisis at your next elections. You know, as we had a crisis in Washington last January. So I would pinpoint that. I would say that, you know, that's something for, you know, Brazilians to be aware of, particularly given how it's worked in other countries and at other times and other places. You know, the COVID question is a strange one, because I actually think that COVID has had different impacts on different political systems at different times. It was pretty clear that at the very beginning, there were a lot of autocracies that made use of COVID to sort of crack down or shut the borders or put new controls on people. The Hungarian government effectively suspended parliament. I mean, there were a number of leaders who made use of COVID to retain power. But over time, it's also become clear that the countries where there's an enormous amount of populist distrust of government, a distrust that's been encouraged by leaders who are trying to undermine their political systems, like, for example, Donald Trump, perhaps like your president, that this led to bad outcomes. And there, in a number of places, the prestige of bureaucrats, of public health officials, of people with some education, with some scientific background, has risen. And in a way, the pandemic has shown that the country, I mean, certainly if you look at what happened in South Korea, what happened in other countries where there's high levels of public trust, it shows that that's a better way to run a country. It's much easier to fight a pandemic if you have high levels of public trust, and very, very difficult to fight it if you have low levels of trust. But what I'm really afraid of, though, is that the legacy of COVID is going to be just the deepening of divisions. So this polarization that we saw developing in so many places, in some countries, has also had a sort of COVID version. In Poland, for example, again, a country that you would think very far from the United States and Brazil, you also have this phenomenon of one political party being in favor of vaccinations, being interested in science, and the other one, at least their followers and voters, much less so. And so, the long-term impact could be very mixed. In some countries, we'll see the prestige of liberal institutions rise, and in others, perhaps not.